Good morning to everyone. My name is Asive Qikwa. I'm from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment under the Biosecurity Directorate Issuing Authority, and my unit is responsible for the permitting of alien and invasive species. So today I'll be sharing a talk with you on the permitting process in terms of the alien and invasive species regulations of 2020.
There you go.
Thank you. So the outline of my presentation will be as follows. First, I'll just have a brief background on the AIS regulations, then discuss why are we issuing permits, and then also touch on the restricted activities in terms of the regulations, the risk assessment process, our permit application process, and then finally I will end with the prescribed fees for lodging of permit applications. So the alien invasive species regulations were published in August 2014 by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and the regulations came into force in October 2014. And in 2020, the regulations were then amended, and then the amendments came into effect on the 1st of March 2021. In terms of the purpose of the regulations, the primary purpose of the regulations is first to prevent the illegal introduction of alien species and the potential invasive species into the country. And then secondly is to regulate invasive species and potentially invasive species which are already occurring in the country. Also, in terms of the regulations, species are categorized into 4 different categories, which the first category is category 1A. This category is whereby species need to be eradicated or completely combated. And then the second category is category 1B, which consists of species that needs to be controlled, and then the control of these species needs to be done in accordance with the species management program. The third category is category 2. Category 2 species are those species with benefits and value. However, the same species have the potential to spread out of the areas where they are utilized and might have potential negative impacts on the surrounding ecosystem and environment. So for this particular species, you require a permit in order to conduct any restricted activities involving those particular species. And then the last category is category 3, and then these are species that are subject to some exemptions and prohibitions. However, further trade of such species is not allowed. And on the next slide, I'll dwell more on why are we issuing permits. So as I mentioned, the species categories, in terms of permitting, we issue permits to regulate category 2 invasive species, which are already occurring in the country. And then secondly, to regulate the import of alien and listed invasive species, which are coming into the country. For an example, we have some category 2 invasive species here, which we issue permits for. One of them is the boa constrictor, which I'm sure the reptile industry is aware of. These are some of the examples that are regulated under category 2 on our list. And then what kind of permits are issued? So in terms of the Act or the regulations, we have restricted activities, which are activities that are conducted by people with the species that we have mentioned, with the species under the different categories. So in terms of permitting, we issue permits in order to carry out a restricted activity involving a specimen or an alien or listed invasive species. And then secondly, we issue permits for research purposes. So as Kay have mentioned, that there's quite a lot of research that is happening within the invasive species sector from various institutions. So for you to be able to conduct such research, you need to apply with us for a permit to conduct those activities, which is research. This is just an explanation of some of the restricted activities as defined in the Act. As I've just mentioned, that we regulate the import or introduction of alien species into the country, which you can see on the first restricted activities, which talks to the import into the country. And as you can also see, these are the categories, 1A, 1B, 2, and category 3. And then if you look at the, if you look at the category 2, for all the restricted activities that are mentioned here, a permit is required for category 2 species. So if you want to conduct any of these activities and with a category 2 listed species, a permit is required. This is just a continuation of some of the restricted activities. I won't dwell more on that. And this is what we have in terms of the species that needs permits. Our species are listed under those different taxons, and in total we have 118 category 2 invasive species that need permits. So if you have any of the species that are listed under category 2, you require a permit for us in order for you to conduct any of the restricted activities that I've talked to on the previous slides. And then I will touch on the risk assessment process. So for each and every application that we receive, we require that you as an applicant provide the risk assessment. So in terms of the regulations, we have 2 risk assessments. So, and this is clearly stipulated on the regulation 16 of our regulations. So the first one is 16.1. This kind of risk assessment is undertaken for an application for an import when you are introducing an alien species into the country, and also for activities that involve growing, breeding, or propagating. Because such activities, there's more risk involved because it brings more propagables into the, if you are introducing a species for breeding purposes, or if you are keeping them from breeding, there's an increased risk as the propagable pressure also increases. So for that, we require that you conduct a full risk assessment in accordance with the regulation 16.1 of the regulations. So this particular risk assessment needs to be conducted by an environmental assessment practitioner. You cannot conduct it as an applicant. And then secondly, the second one that we have is just basically a summary of some of the things that we want on the comprehensive risk assessment. It applies to those species that are already listed as category 2, those species that are already in the country that know that people already have the species. So what we normally require from that is basic information like the nature of the restricted activities that you're conducting, the species that you have, such as the taxonomy of the species, and secondly, the area where you'll be conducting the activities, and in addition to that, also what measures do you have, or what measures do you propose in order to combat any potential of the species escaping or spreading outside the area where you are utilizing it. So you as the applicant can conduct that risk assessment on your own. We just, in the way we just call it information required. So we do have a guideline that we provide you with that you can follow. So you just do that research on your own and then complete that, and then you have to attach it to your application form. So for this one, you don't require the service of an IP. You can just conduct it on your own, as opposed to the first one. And then I'm also going to touch on the process for applying for permits. So in terms of alien species, which are new introductions, you as the applicant, you first identify a species of interest that you want to introduce or import into the country. And then after that, you obtain a permit application from us and the guidelines in terms of our risk assessment. And then once we have provided you with this, you can lodge an application form and the risk assessment to our office. And then from there, upon receipt of the application, we verify if the application is complete, and if it's not complete, we are immediately after receiving the application, We verify and we acknowledge the receipt of the application and then verify if everything is complete. And if not, we respond to you in the acknowledgement. And what else do you still need to provide? And then from there, there is an AIS, this is Risk Assessment Review Panel, of which each secretariat sits with the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI. We then refer the application to SANBI. Then SANBI, ASRAP, which is understand. Then ASRAP sends, ASRAP receives the meetings when they sit, and then when they sit, they review the risk assessment that we send to them, and then they make recommendations to DIA, to DFF, to our department. And then once we have received the recommendations from SANBI, we consider the recommendations that they have provided to us, and after that we take a decision on whether the permit we reject or issue the permit. And once a decision has been taken, we then notify the applicant of any objections or decision that has been taken with regard to the issuing of the permit or rejection thereof. And then secondly, it's a similar process, but this one applies to species that are already occurring in the country. For example, category 2 species that have already eluded on. So there's only, it's a similar process, however, there's a change in terms of now where do we send the application to for review and for recommendations or inputs. So same as the previous one, once you have identified the species of interest, you obtain the application form, you lodge the application, and upon the receipt of the documents, you acknowledge same process. However, now it changed at this stage. Then instead of sending the application to ASRAP now, we send the application to the affected province. So for example, if we receive the application from a region here in the KwaZulu-Natal province, or we refer the application to Asive. So then Asive will then provide us with inputs in terms of the application. And once we have received those inputs from the province, we then consider the inputs that they've given us, and then from there we reach a decision again on whether we will issue the permit or not. Then after a decision has been taken, we then notify the applicant on the decision that we have taken. I just had some stats to just give a breakdown of what's the status quo in the KwaZulu-Natal province in terms of applications that were received, and then this is data from the previous financial year. But even though it's COVID, but there's still some work that was being done. So in terms of the previous financial year, which was 2021-2022, we received a total of 385 applications from KwaZulu-Natal, of which we issued 394 permits. So a total for the whole of the country. So and then for KwaZulu-Natal, the applications were 36, of which we issued 34 of those 34 permits. So these are permits that we have issued per taxa in the KwaZulu-Natal province. Then the next slide talks to the prescribed fees for lodging permit applications. So if you want to import a species into the country, the applicable fee is 200 rand per species. And then for all the other restricted activities is 100 rand per species. And then if you want to renew a permit that is about to expire, it's 50 rand per species. And then for appeals, it's 50 rands. Then, I think I've reached the end of my presentation. I thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Q. We now have an opportunity for the audience, if we have any questions with regards to the process of permitting, before we move on to compliance. You'll see we're doing it in a very specific order so that it makes sense. We have a question over there. Warren, gentleman on the right. Please announce yourself, your name and where you are from.
Morning everyone, it's Brent Coverdale. I'm the mammal and bird scientist for Ismvela KZN Wildlife. So one is a comment and the other is a question. So we must never forget that conservation is a concurrent competency in terms of the constitution, and so that does bring into a little bit of conflict because there's pre-existing legislation that also requires permits for certain imports and exports that often applicants are not aware of. So they apply for an AIS permit and they forget about the ordinance requires a similar permit, and so they get their AIS permit and they think it's all good to go, and they start bringing stuff into the province and they haven't been issued an ordinance permit. And so yes, that does require cooperation between ourselves and the department, but that message also needs to go out there that there is still the ordinance that is in line. And we're fortunate we do have a good relationship, but it doesn't mean that because you've got one that the other will automatically be issued or you don't need it. So that's just a comment that we do provide input onto these applications, but applicants still potentially require an ordinance permit, and I think that's quite important. The other thing is a question is, and it maybe comes around understanding. So on a 1B, and I'm going to use a specific example around European wild boar. So it's listed as a 1B when not feral. So how do we define for, if you're an applicant, what is not feral? So my understanding is if it's in captivity, but how do we define captivity? Because we have an example where an application was applied for to keep an animal, a wild boar, in captivity. But where it was coming from was, in my case, the wild. It was coming from a game farm, which everything is then prohibited, if my understanding. So if it's 1B in the wild, you can't do anything with it. You can't sell it, you can't donate it, you can't do anything. But in theory, a permit has been applied for from it to go. So where do we draw that line of when something is not feral? That's the question, because it's a little bit misleading in terms of the regulations. When is something not feral?
So the question was, if a species is category 1B, can you apply for a permit? My understanding is you cannot. Only category 2 species can be applied for a permit. Is that correct?
Yes.
We received an application for 1B species.
But then the permit will not be issued.
Well, the department sent it to us for comment, so surely it should not have been issued in the first place, or the applicant should have just been told, forget about it. I don't know, you see, this is the problem, it's actually around the regs as opposed to permitting. You've created this little when not feral. And so, to me, it should either be, because it's got a potential to become invasive, we shouldn't be even permitting them, we should just be allowing the existing populations to die out. Because now you've created this loophole when something's not feral. Who's going to decide that? That's what I'm asking. Who decides the outcomes when it's not feral? Because I might say it's a feral population, the person whose property is, no, I've controlled it on my property. So then is it considered, then it doesn't need a permit, then they can then do what they like with it.
Okay, you can chip in.
Do you want to answer for question? Answer. Okay, we have an answer from the department. There we go.
Morning. My name is Katche. So, zoo and botanical gardens are allowed to apply for research. They're allowed to apply for any category. Permit can be issued for 1B if you're doing research. When we talk about feral, it's something that it's not under control. So if something's not under control, why would we issue a permit for something under control? We don't issue a permit for species that are not under control. For example, if you are applying for mallard and it's not caged, we had an application in Joburg where this mallard, they said it flew in, and we asked, will it fly out? Of course, because it's not pinned, it will fly out. So the purpose of the regulation is to control and make sure that there's no representation between indigenous and other species or invasive species. So if you are not in control of the species, we'll never issue a permit for that. So we only issue a permit when we believe that the conditions that we've given you, if you comply with them, then we will be able to deal with invasive species. But if we realize you weren't able to do that, we don't give a permit. However, we are able to if there are things within the regulation that might not, with some of the stakeholders, look not favoring to them, we are open. And as the gentleman said, that we have meetings with them. Actually, I think today there's a meeting as well today with the province. So we're able to iron those things out and find solutions, because we cannot do this job by ourselves. There's more experience in the province, and they assist us to make those decisions. And of course, we do have some differences sometimes, but we do our best to find solutions so that we all work together well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that explanation, Katashela. I think it's good that we highlight that there are some grey areas which need to be ironed out. Do we have any more questions with regards to permitting?
Hi, my name is Adrian Edgerton, and for my sins, I'm an EAP. Sir, your comment that an EAP must do the risk assessment terrified me. Absolutely terrified me. The bulk of EAPs in this country, sadly, don't know one alien invasive species from an indigenous one. And I think one needs to clearly look very carefully at that regulation. When you put the regulation up, you said a risk assessment practitioner. Very different to an EAP. But please, if you guys are relying on EAPs, and I'm blocking my own people here, then we have a problem. I was speaking to Kay earlier about it. So just a concern from me that the use of EAPs to do risk assessments on alien invasive plants, any invasive species, is really quite scary. It's problematic. It really is problematic. I mean, I've got EAPs who tell me how beautiful the yellow flowers are on the side of the roads at the moment. Come on, guys.
Well, thank you for that comment. I think that's important to take note of. We have a question in front of this one. Thank you. And then Katashela, would like to.
Thank you. Mike Buckland, Conjini Conservancy. I don't know if this is the correct time, but going back to the QARA regulations, you had 4 things, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 was basically a watch list. We don't have that in the current regulation, anything for a watch list. And there are things that I believe are merging and need dealing with. And the question is, how do we go about bringing that to the fore, and where can we get it going? I mentioned the weed, the Dromeria cordata, tropical chickweed. It's just spreading through parks, pavements, it's spread, vehicles, weed eaters, etc., etc. That's the one question. And then the next question, going compliance. Previously, they were looking at before properties were issued sale or transfer, they were required to undergo a property evaluation as far as ARPs are concerned. That's kind of fallen away, but it could potentially be brought in under municipal bylaws, if so be, because it's one way of really getting people's attention when it starts hurting the pocket, if and when they need to do these things. So I just pose those 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think with regards to the property issue, we know that that went back to the lawmakers, and there were constitutional issues around it. That's what's been bypassed. And early detection is, of course, hugely important. And if memory serves me right, it's SANBI, which is responsible for early detection within South Africa of new invasive species, that falls under their umbrella, and it's what they get paid to do. Debbie, yes?
Yes, just with regards to, excuse me, QARA versus NEMBA. QARA is currently being updated to fall in line with NEMBA. They're currently working, the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development are currently working on QARA to bring QARA in line with NEMBA. So there will be an alignment between the legislation shortly, and I don't know how long shortly it's going to be, but they're currently working on that base.
Thank you for that information. That's obviously the Department of Agriculture which is responsible for that one. One last question for the gentleman in in front, because we'll have to move on. We do have to watch our time.
How's it, everybody? I'm Wayne Westcott. I'm a wetland and aquatic specialist. I just have a question with regards to the timing of the permits. So we've got our water use license timelines, we've got our EIA timelines, but for these there aren't specific regulated timeframes in which one needs to be analysed and then granted. Obviously we understand that capacity is an issue, but just to have an idea of when you think there would be time frames allocated to these permits.
Okay, thank you for the question. In terms of our time frames, just that I didn't have it on the presentation. From the day of receipt of your application, it takes us up to 60 working days to issue the permit. So, however, normally when we receive the application, after having reviewed it and all your documents are complete, that's when the 60 working days start to kick in. So if you submit and then it's incomplete, we acknowledge receipt of the application and we inform you that it's incomplete, then that 60 working days doesn't kick in yet. Then once you've provided all the outstanding documents, then that's where it kicks in. So we can issue it anytime within that 60 working days.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Hugh. Thank you very much for that. All right, I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, and then while she's coming, we're going to give an opportunity for a comment. Our next speaker is Cherise Chetty, and Cherise is Environmental Management Inspector Compliance here in KZN, Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. And while she's coming forward, we want to give Sheila a chance to make a comment.
Yeah, I'm responding to the question about the use of IPs. They are just allowed people to do the risk assessment, but they don't have to be experts. So the regulation does say they have to consult experts on doing that risk assessment. So I just need to address that.